Cartographer community meeting. So today is November 3rd. And let me share the screen. Okay, yeah, feel free to add yourself to the attendees list. Today we are hoping to have some um, special guests. We hope they are able to join to discuss the RFC 14, for example. Okay, well, again, welcome everyone, and let's jump straight to the TLDR. You see this as I've been following the engagement stats for the recordings on YouTube, and now that we have a TLDR at the beginning, seems to be increasing the attention or the engagement of the users out there watching the recording. So I think it's useful. So thank you, Joshua, for putting out the notes here.
Yeah, no problem. So I guess we'll jump right into it. We've got, so what's new this week? We've got a big breaking change. We have now renamed Pipeline. So Pipeline service was kind of poorly named. So we've gone with Runnable, so Runnable service, whatever you want to call it. So now that the CRD pairings make a bit more sense, so now we have a Runnable, which has a cluster run template. So again, yeah, it's a big breaking change. And then the things we have coming up. So I linked the project board as the first item there, so everyone can take a look at our whole roadmap. But the big items are in the supply chain, where we're looking at using informers now instead of just doing some short polling, the reconcile loop. Yeah, so that's our project board right there. So yeah, supply chain, we're just using informers instead of short polling. And for delivery, we started working on promoting a deployment, which is, the idea that you're going to be running some checks against a deployment after it has succeeded or failed. And then after that, we're going to start looking at verifying a deployment, which is different from promoting in the sense that verifying a deployment means that you might actually be running tests or checks against an active deployment. So you need to keep that deployment around or lock on it until all of your downstream checks have finished. So yeah, those are the big items that we're looking at.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joshua. Okay, that's great. In terms of new RFCs, we have the RFC 14 that was created, I believe, was last week, and been very active. Well, I was expecting for Paul Warren to join. He was supposed to join, but well, it's early for him. So meanwhile, to see if some of the active conversation here in this RFC, if someone else would like to jump in and provide comments about the current status.
Yeah, I don't know. I can take this, or Stephen, I don't know if you want to jump in.
I mean, I pointed out that there's already an RFC, RFC3, that addresses the same use case and notes that an alternative approach is the approach laid out here. I know that Stephen commented in RFC3 that he would prefer to keep state on the workload. I will say that one of my concerns is the workload. My impression is the workload is meant to be like this dev-friendly artifact. And if we start storing an immense amount of state on that, I worry that it becomes a little intimidating. But otherwise, it's functionally the same. Like some object in the cluster needs to store the state.
I think some prior art here is, I think Argo uses some resource the user interacts with, I forget, to hold a similar tree of executions and just like state of workflow runs. Yeah, Sierra mentions, it uses the workflow itself that the workflow run is based off of. So that's part of the influence, is just that there's some prior art for a thing that looks kind of like this that we could base it off of. I think it's also kind of, the flip side of, we are putting a lot of data in that object that a user might access a lot, is that that data is something the user is going to care deeply about, because it describes where their artifacts are in the progression through the infrastructure created by their workloads. That's kind of my thinking there.
I guess my opinion would be that so long as it's in the status, then it's it's a JQ away from filtering what you need to know. I think most people are fairly au fait with filtering their objects.
We could also make kube control describe, do a prettier version of that that tree and kind of the status of the current execution, which is a nice advantage of keeping it in the context of that resource, because there is a way to see it in a nicer way. So we could even do a JQ free version if we wanted.
I'm being someone who doesn't like describe because it's usually omitting something I care about. I wasn't aware that we had significant control over that, so that's cool to know.
So I guess maybe we could talk about like the two different approaches that are proposed here. I think there's, so if we actually look at what the status might look like in this RFC, the original proposal was very output centric in the status, where like once you produce an output, then you can like link back to inputs as they were produced. I did propose a bit of a different structure, which is actually like a full tree view of how things are created. I don't know if anyone has any opinions on either approach.
Trees. Yeah, I think of them as a tree that has. Excuse me for just a moment. I'm going to find a quieter spot.
Yeah, my concern immediately with trees is just that I mean, is it always rooted in the workload, this tree? Is that the idea?
It's potentially. So the way that I've written it out is that it's actually rooted in the first element that emits a value.
Right. I'll have to review it. I'm just concerned about the fact that you can write a supply chain with two disconnected sets of components.
What's the advantage of this tree view over having a flat view with all the artifacts at the top and then references between them?
I think either could work, right? I just, in the original RFC, the output for source omits the URL portion of it. And I think that might be important. And so we would just need to figure out like a way of referencing previous outputs based on like a multi-field reference. Like I mean, it could be simple, right? We could just name them or something like that, but.
Yeah, I was wondering if like, are you saying that like there's no commit identifier on source, and so you have to key off the URI, and like maybe there's a risk that one of the types doesn't have a unique ID, and so it'd be hard to key back or something like that. It's like a practical problem.
Yeah, like source has multiple identifiers. Yeah, exactly.
We could generate.
And the other thing was just I figured that this approach might reduce a bit of duplication, depending on how the keying works and stuff. But
I worry about, this is a little bit, I don't know, just for the purpose of argument sort of, but I worry about like if we ever have to do a lookup on a particular artifact, if you have a flat list, you can find that artifact and then derive things from it. If you have this tree, you kind of have to traverse the tree every time you want to find something. It probably isn't going to make a difference performance-wise, like unless you had some absurdly long supply chain. But I think that is kind of an advantage of keeping all the artifacts at the top, is they're all immediately referenceable.
I'd second that with the JQ comment I made earlier. If you're using a command line query just to validate information too, you're more likely to just go and want to ask by some known key or identifier, not this child of this child of this child.
it's easier to go from that flat list to a tree than it is to go from a tree to the individual items in the list. I think is maybe a way to express that. But I agree there's a problem with the identifiers. Like we need to assign we either have to say, for source, this field is always an ID and you can use it that way. Or we'd have to say a reference has to include the whole definition of the other type. Or we'd have to say we're going to generate UUIDs for everything and then use those to cross-reference, which would work also, I think.
Yeah. But the other advantage I think of a tree structure is it's just easier to look at if you're looking at the status, right? I mean, maybe we don't want people looking at the status, and maybe we are going to have a parser of sorts. But like a flat object, an array of outputs is not that easy to look at and try and figure out what's going on. But.
I would agree. If we're going with a flat list, we need to provide that tree to someone, because it will be nigh impossible. It'd be very difficult for me to reason about. what is this telling me?
But in terms of how we actually store it, I really don't have a strong opinion either way.
And just flat records are generally the best way to pass data that's record-like, that has foreign keys.
Yeah. Here's Mr. Paul Warren. Paul, welcome. You're the original author of the RFC 14.
Sorry, I was late.
Would like to chime in?
I had problems with my computer this morning.
Colin, welcome. Thank you for joining.
No problem. Thank you for looking at the RFC.
Yeah, we're discussing the some possible approaches to address this. Just wanted to see the original idea behind the RFC. What are your opinions on the discussions here in the PR?
Yeah, I had a very quick look at the comments last night, right before I went to bed. So I really haven't had much time to digest them yet, unfortunately. But I can spend some time on it today and comment on the actual RFC itself if you want. But regards to the last conversation, I mean, everything everyone is saying makes sense. Yeah, I can see the pros and cons of all approaches. But
Paul, do you mind giving a quick background on your use case and like what this solves for you?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. So when you're a consumer of a supply chain, I mean, we have this technology, and it behaves in certain ways. You know, by design. It kind of strings together a set of what would be independent objects that have backing controllers that can all do work, and the supply chain kind of choreographs these together. Hence why it was originally called Cartographer or something like that. And that behavior is all very good and useful for automated workflows, but for workflows that are more user-centric, I think it's going to be necessary to impose some structure on top of that. A case in point being our tooling. If you can imagine you're a developer sitting in an IDE and you've made some changes to your code and you then want to debug your code, you either automatically or personally, if you're just manually doing this, you know, when you send your changes, you then have to wait for the source code to become a running thing before you can actually connect to that instance and start debugging it. So we need to wait, right? We need to wait around for that to happen. Like I said, the user could do it manually, but we could do it automatically. And, you know, looking at prior art that was out there, looking at the fact that Kubernetes itself was playing around with a kubectl wait, it seemed that there was some precedent there to try and impose this more imperative workflows on top of the kind of eventual workflows of the system underneath. So that was really the genesis of it in a nutshell. There is a bit of a last mile problem here, in my opinion. When you look at what we have to do, we really do have to wait for the eventual pod to be running, because when we try and connect the debugger, that's the thing we're actually connecting to. Obviously we're not connecting to the CAP app or the Knative service or the replica set underneath that. We're actually connecting to the pod. So in some senses, this doesn't go far enough, because there is a little bit of a last mile problem there for us. But I thought it was worth investigating whether there was enough utility in this to kind of standalone separately from that, and we can solve the last mile problem separately. But there is that from my perspective, there is that issue with it. But that's something that we have worked around, and something we could continue to kind of work around. But that was the origins of the idea, really. Does that make sense?
It does. I was just wondering if I could restate it.
Yeah.
As a
I'm not a morning
developer.
person, so
No, you're fine. I just I think you're talking about, I just want to get above the implementation just for a second. So as a developer, I would like the current state of my code. I would like to know when the current state of my code is available to debug in a pod.
Yeah.
All right. And
That's
I think that's, yeah, okay. And that's I mean, I hear you that you might think it's your last mile problem, but it's certainly worth us considering what we can do there to add indicators or some sort of informer mechanism that is just that we could add to our templates to be able to say, oh, well, actually it is deployed, and you can go and find the important artifacts that matter to you here. So we can add that to considerations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other aspect of this, which I'm not sure about myself, I have nowhere near as much context on the Cartographer itself. I spent a day or so reading the code, so I roughly know how it works down there. But of course, I don't have the context. But the other thing that strikes me is I know there's this delivery system, and where the thing you're sending to the supply chain may not end up on the same cluster, and it may end up being commit somewhere else, which gets picked up and sent to other places. And I don't quite know how we deal with that in this scenario. Clearly, this is oriented around single cluster use cases, I would imagine, unless there's some way of tracking changes across clusters in the single status of the originating workload. I don't know. So that was the other thing that I was.
Would that be desirable for IDE oriented?
Not for us. No, I don't care about that. But from a general utility of the RFC,
sure.
Something that I was also a little bit concerned about.
So just to double check, hey Bob, would it be the workflow from a developer? Is this? Are they making a commit for this? Right. Okay. So this is, what are they doing so that Cartographer is triggered, I guess?
Yeah. So the plugins we have today, you can instigate. There's kind of two features that we built really. One is debug, one is live update, and so the user initiates those in their IDE, and they may have made code changes, they may not have made code changes, and the job for us is to figure out when we can tell them that live update is ready to use, and when we physically try and connect the debugger. So these are actions that cause or invoke through the IDE.
Makes sense. Okay.
And then what we do, just so you're aware, if you want, like what we do in the IDE today, is we have like this generic wait service effectively, and we know that the workload's been applied, so we watch it or we go grab it, knowing that we've instigated or our user has instigated the action. And we then pluck the information off the workload. So we say, well, all right, we can see source code's changed, and we can see the debug flag was enabled. And then effectively we sit in a little wait loop, waiting for conditions to become true on the eventual pod. So we have to go discover the pod. There's a little bit of complexity there, but not much. So from the workload, we discover the pod. We know what changed when the workload was applied. So we sit in this little wait loop and we wait for various conditions to become true, which are typically like, does the delivered pod have the right source code digest, which we manually apply over the top of the supply chain today. We use the EPOCI source label on the image. We shove the source digest in that, so it's present on the eventual image, and then we use a developer convention to grab that digest and put it on the actual pod, so it's there. So generally speaking, we wait for the source code to be present on the running pod. We wait for the relevant flag to be enabled, so that could be debug or live update, depending on what they triggered, and we wait for the pod to be running. That's kind of what we're doing in the IDE, in case that's any help in kind of reasoning about a more generic version of that on the platform. So yeah, and the other interesting thing about it is we've actually got rid of it now, but I could see it easily coming back. So from a user perspective, we've written a supply chain, and in fact it was this way until a few days ago. We wrote a supply chain that can trigger in multiple places at the same time. So, live update, it was true for debug, but it's no longer true for debug, which is probably a better example given that we're discussing debug. So we had written a supply chain where the debug flag that you toggle on or off was an input into both KPAC build and the developer conventions, the config service. And so when you trigger that debug flag to be true, the supply chain will, I'm probably not using the right terms, but the terms I understand, the supply chain will trigger in multiple places. It will trigger both a KPAC build and a config service at the same time, which will actually end up causing you having two revisions of your Knative service to roll through in reasonably quick succession. And again, from an IDE perspective, we kind of have to reason about that, because they may not have changed source code. So the only thing we're waiting for is the debug flag. So it's entirely, so we have to wait for the right image to, we still have to wait for the right image to appear on the eventual pod. We can't just try attaching to the first pod that comes into existence in that new revision that came from the trigger of the config service, because we know there's one behind that. Now, like I said, there's we've actually changed that behavior now, because the Java build pack deprecated their build time flag for debugging, so we only actually need to trigger the supply chain. So we only need to feed that input into the supply chain in one place, which means it'll only trigger in one place. But some of the complexity that you might see, some of the sort of complexity you might see underneath this.
If I could just restate yet another
Sure.
scenario, I just
go for it. Yeah.
Make sure that I'm understanding. So you're saying that it's not always the it's not just the digest or state of source that is the only thing you're looking for as an identifier, as a cause for an eventual outcome.
Yes, yeah, because the developer may invoke debug and they may not have changed the source code in between those two sessions, their last session and the current session. And so in those instances, you don't need to wait, or you don't want to wait for the source code. You only want to wait for the new revision where debug was turned on. And sometimes they didn't do anything. So they literally stopped debug and started debug again. And in those instances, you need to know that you can connect the debugger right away. So those are the kind of 3 scenarios actually we're waiting for. And if it's helpful, I can add that detail into here, because it is some nuances in the it is some nuances of the problem, I think. And then taking that more
It is
generally.
interesting, right, to me, because I was going to try and generalize that. It's the idea that, you know, your workload config is changing, and to me, it's like we have a question of whether or not your outputs are still valid at all if your underlying config has changed, right? Because you could be changing a debug flag, but your workload config could also change to point to a different, you know, a different URL or something like that, right? And in that case, maybe it's worth just invalidating all of our outputs in that case.
This is why I was asking you earlier about whether workload was the root of the tree, because if we don't look at it that way, then we have multiple roots for the tree. That makes having a tree representation even more pointless to me. That's why I'm always averse to representing that information tree-wise, unless you can guarantee it's a rooted tree. So that was, but I think maybe that's solved by finding a way to make sure it's always rooted in some sort of like something that we can categorically say this cause followed by this cause will eventually lead to this one. And you can retract that tree, or to treat it as rootless and to have another mechanism, which may be more complicated for consumers such as Paul, right? To find reasons to claim that this is the output of what you asked for.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, yeah, I think the workload is the root of the tree, but whether that holds true for more generic use cases, I don't know. The other thing is that the supply chain can be triggered in the middle by external events which are nothing to do with us too. So I think the classic example here is KPAC. In response to having a new base run image may do work, right? That controller may do, sorry, Stephen, I'm using the wrong terms, I apologize, but the KPAC controller may may do some work yielding a new image, which would then trigger the supply chain at the config service. So in that case, I don't know what the root is.
Yeah, I would say the root is still the workload. It's just suddenly there's a new branch off of.
A new branch of it, yeah.
I don't know if I view the workload as a root of the tree. I think there's 2 separate trees in my mind. There's the tree of infrastructure, right? Which is very simple. It's like, you know, on the cluster, the workload owns these kind of services that, you know, process artifacts, right? But then if you look at if the tree we're talking about right now is a tree of artifacts, right, that have references to what pieces of infrastructure they've, you know, been processed by, that have references to other artifacts they were generated from, that we've created a mapping for, right? The workload applies across all of the resources at the same time. Its parameters can be referenced by any template, right? And while those parameters can change, right, it's providing input to everything simultaneously. It's not really passing artifacts forward, right? It's passing configuration forward. When you provide the source to Flux, you're not providing, you know, the source code to Flux. You're giving it the location of a Git repo, a branch, not a particular revision that it's going to then generate artifacts from, right? So because it's an artifact tree, you know, and workload doesn't produce any artifacts. It just provides configuration to all the templates. I don't really see it as rooting that tree of artifacts. I think it is an unrooted tree. You can have every step in the supply chain could be totally unrelated to every other step. And the proper way to represent that is, everything separately with no references, between them, right? And so I don't know, that's.
But they also, like, the workload is itself an artifact. Like, that's the artifact that those things are pointing to. And the example that you just gave is it's a tree that has one root and everything else is a leaf.
What?
They don't have to point to the workload. Just point that out.
That is true. Then you have a graph that is you have a disconnected graph.
What makes the workload an artifact? Like, the workload to me is like a KPAC image, right? It's a resource on the cluster that has some referenceable configuration, but it's not. The workload doesn't get promoted, right? It's static. Artifacts are immutable and they move between the things, right? The workload is static and mutable. The user can change it over time, right? And it doesn't pass any kind of immutable configuration forward through the steps. So to me, the workload is like a pretty separate concept. Artifacts would be like commit ABC123. Image with this digest, right? Or this exact snippet of Kate's configuration with this SHA to represent the, that could be used as a unique identifier for it. And those things are all moving between the steps, whereas the workload is like configuration that you use to set up all the templates. It's that all of them can reference.
I think
I guess bound with its RV, you could
way.
consider it. When bound with its RV, you could consider it an artifact. Maybe that's a way that we could. Its resource version, right? Maybe that's a way that we could try to ground the tree if it makes it easier.
I would just make a flat list and then have references. That makes sense.
I do understand what you're saying. I just I wasn't really arguing about the shape of the representation, more about Paul's initial problem, which is he needs to be able to relate initial state, as far as he's concerned, or a change of state, to when that is eventually reconciled into something he needs to be able to debug, right?
Yeah,
just trying to jump out of the actual.
I don't think calling the workload an artifact helps with that goal, right? Because then
I think you're right.
It's the same thing as every top level thing existing at the top level versus every top level thing pointing to the same thing, right? And then having to figure out when something kind of isn't. Like, I think not just every top level thing would point to the workload in a workload case, but literally every artifact would end up pointing to the workload, because the workload is input to every template, not just templates that don't consume outputs from other templates, right? And so
it's also not sufficient. It's insufficient, right? Because it points to something like main, which is not, not what the person, what anyone who's going to consume this tree needs. Maybe Paul will be fine because it will use a specific image reference instead, and he could treat it as an artifact, but not everyone could.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't think the workload is helpful in that case, but I also think that Paul has options for, using the artifact tree in order to figure out where things start and where things end heuristically. So, like, for instance, that a particular revision of source code is getting uploaded, right? And you can find that revision in the graph, and you can follow that revision to, something that looks, something that maybe is a cluster template that doesn't have any more outputs, and then you should know where you end up. So instead of looking at the tree holistically, like, I have to figure out the beginning and end of this thing that doesn't have a beginning and end, you actually know where you're starting, and you kind of know where you want to end. You should be able to follow that to, kind of get your end result.
I'll make this my last comment because I don't want to drag it on, but I do think there's still value in the workload as an artifact, or the workload with its revision as an artifact, and not as the root of a tree, but just as a source of information, because that's where the configuration that has changed will have to be combined with a revision. So you've got a revision of code and the debug flag, and he'll need to be able to find both those pieces of information as a cause for an outcome.
You're saying, like, if you have an artifact in the tree, that artifact, some of the input that occurred to create that artifact is all of the parameters in the workload. I think that's true, but I also think that there's other sources of information besides the workload that lead to and the inputs into a resource that lead to the creation of the artifact. And KPAC is another good example of this. So it's going to build an image. The workload inputs are an input into that image. The source code that passed the unit tests is an input into that image, but also the builder configuration on the cluster, also has a really big effect on the input into that image. So if we want to capture like even more detailed information for reproducibility, we should do that. And I think we can capture that in the artifact tree, which is I think what you're saying. But
Yeah,
it's harder than just also sourcing the workload. There's information that each service is allowed to bring in separately.
Agree.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if we can make an effort to short circuit development that might be in the wrong direction here by actually testing hypotheses, or if anyone actually thinks that's necessary at this point. Is it better just to start collecting statuses of each artifact and see how we go, or should we actually try some spikes?
What would a quick spike look like? What would be the thing you want to approve or disprove?
I think that at least Paul's use case is solvable. Yeah, I think. I mean, Paul, do you think the information is? But it's just because Paul presented an RFC and then has talked about some other edge cases this afternoon, so this morning, that might still not be covered there. And I was just wondering if we need to go a little deeper before we embark.
Is it a genuine, I guess, use case that you feel that should be solved with Cartographer? I guess that would be one of my first things. Is there a general consensus of a nod of the head or shake of the head? Yeah.
I do.
That's a good start. That's good. So and so yeah, okay. So that makes sense. If there's something, maybe we could just write up what a spike could look like, some kind of criteria. Maybe if there's any major concerns anybody's got, maybe we could drop them into there as a comment and try and prove that out as part of the spike.
I mean, I guess my point is I'd like to know whether we should do spike or we should just progress. I just feel a little like there's some risk we might be able to mitigate, but I'm not sure. Some people have better broad concepts here.
Big advocate of spiking something and then coming back maybe and presenting and talking, getting more feedback, and then.
I think a spike can mean different things to different people. That's maybe a thing to point out, is like some people might view a spike as something you throw out completely after you're done and start over again with some TDD process or something. Other people might view a spike as a first version of an implementation that you're going to come back and improve later, right? So I think that depends on
right. Well, the latter one is I actually presented both options, so I'm obviously treating spike as the one that you throw out, or that you don't expect to be resolved work. You might keep it if it proves to be good, but the alternative was to start on the RFC and just present that.
My view on the spike is to quickly prove out if this is valid, any concerns that there are. If it works, build on top of it and get and use it. So maybe this is just terminology, but I think the fastest way to get, if there's something that we want, if we're not too sure about, the fastest way is to try it and get some feedback and share with the group, I think.
Ciro, could you vocalize your question? I don't think it's great.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, the concern that I had was with regards to like, what if we end up generating these like artifact traces, but then we're missing details that are important. So for instance, imagine you have like a source to test to let's say build. And in that test, we're running like a Tecton pipeline. To run the pipeline for each step, you're gonna need to use a container image for that, right? As of right now, in the pipelines that I wrote at least, I've been always putting like, oh, image Golang, right? So it's like it's hard coded there. But what I would imagine in an ideal scenario is that those images, like Golang for that pipeline, gets fed into that pipeline coming as an artifact that's kept track of in the supply chain. Like just how at the beginning of the supply chain, we have like a Git repository. I would imagine that, oh, we have also an image repository that's keeping track of that Golang image, so that if there's a bump to that image, like in this artifact trace that we're generating, we can see that like, oh, before, like let's say 2 weeks ago, we were testing with Golang 1.13, but there was a bump. Now it was 1.14, and things broke, right? And you can tell exactly why that broke, with which version of Go, things like that. But then, but every time it comes back to KPack, I'm always like, oh, but the builder will get an update under the hood. And like, how do we deal with those cases? Like, is it more of a guidance where we should just go for like, well, it might be that you have resources in our supply chain that are going to get updates under the hood, and yeah, we're not going to be able to see them. You have to use other ways of figuring that trace out. Or yeah, like or should we like raise warnings about that stuff if you're able to detect that, oh, like an artifact was produced but no inputs changed, things like that.
Well, that's a
That might be
curious
a
one. I like
concern
that.
to write down. Sorry, go ahead.
I think that every resource in every individual resource is going to be a resource that can kick off new work based on the tree above it and some external state of the world. That KPack is one that we think about a lot because there's that builder object, but it's no different from the source because the source is looking at some Git repository that gets updated outside in the world. And I'd argue further that any resource that is determinative, that doesn't rely on any outside source, could just be folded in. It like almost isn't. I think it's more different than the other artifacts that we have than it is similar. I think the default should be a mental model that says we have like our logical supply chain. I think the workload is a piece of that. It is a provision of information that is very observable to Cartographer, and then each node, each resource represents something that's going to take all that observable information and mix it with some unobservable state in the world, and that's the value that that all those resources that we're choreographing provide.
I think this highlights maybe a like the use case is quite specific. From Paul, there is one unknown, which, like you said, sources are just another example, right? So one unknown is what's the actual source code, right? And Paul needs to observe that the source code he knows about is finally picked up, which we get because it ends up as an artifact during the process. And then there are unknowns, which is the state, the parameterization he put into workload, right? I think in Paul's case, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in Paul's case, it doesn't matter that KPack wanted to build it again for some reason, right? As long as there's a stable delivery that he can target. And there may be edge cases around that. It may be problematic. And I think what it comes down to is in a much broader story, not one where you're in a loop on a developer machine, but like getting to staging and into production, is that you want to know what caused you to get where you are, so that you can either one, reproduce it, or two, at least just know why something changed, cause for change, right? If the resources don't tell us the cause for change, we need to talk to the people who use those resources about improving them, right? Because we need to know that. I mean, users need to know that information. If they do tell us what their resource causes are, they should be findable in the tree, in the sense that we should be able to say, this is the image that got produced, and it was produced by this object's run. And that will be about whether we want to log that information or we want to copy forward state from those underlying stamped objects when we pull out the status. And I think that's a later decision we can make, but either one are available, right?
to add to that, like I feel like the tree we're generating right now is just representative of the movement of artifacts between the infrastructure that Cartographer is creating. And there are other tools, like I don't think we're ever going to be able to capture every single possible inputs that changed and triggered a change, inputs that changed arbitrarily between builds, right? But both of those could happen even in Tecton. You reference an image instead of feeding it from another job by tag, and it could be a different image on the subsequent run, right? There are other tools that handle that, like Tecton chains, that give you that kind of traceability. So you can know, oh, this particular run, came from all this metadata. KPack can do something similar and capture. Actually, KPack captures all this on the image that gets generated. So all the build pack versions, all the runtimes, actually a complete SBOM of every runtime dependency with a high guarantee that you can use for vulnerability scanning with CPEs and Perl identifiers. Like every input into it ends up captured on the image in that case, right? And so you can actually key from that image identifier and know, oh yes, it was this exact set of dependencies that triggered it. So I think because different tools have different ways of providing that complete artifact traceability, right? Tecton through chains, KPack through an enormous amount of metadata, right? We can focus this tree on the providing a representation of what's moving between the infrastructure that we've created, right? Instead of trying to provide full traceability for all inputs for all artifacts ever, which I think is we can do, but maybe it's not this way. I also agree with the idea that we could add additional keys to the status. So if you wanted to capture arbitrary additional information, the resources exposed in their status, right? Like if you wanted the build packs to be part of that tree for whatever reason, or if you wanted a Tecton chains, output of some sort, I haven't looked too closely at the project, but to be associated with that particular thing in the tree, there could be optional things that you can reference in the spec of the template that pull from the status, just like we do for outputs that are like, also capture this information. But I think we could worry about that later if we wanted to.
I think it just fits inside the use case that Paul originally placed, and I think it could go further too. So I'm not trying to advocate for it today, but that we could not only say, hey, arbitrarily pick these keys out of the status of the object stamped, but we'll also happily walk the ownership tree for you if you ask us to, so that you can pull something out of the ownership tree, like the pod that got created, or something that would be useful. And it would be probably very much a local dev solution, not used often in the staging and production world, but those are thoughts, all right, but the information should be captured by the tools, and I think we agree on that, right? By the resources we use, not but not by Cartographer.
Okay, that's great. That's a really nice conversation. Is there any action item that we should capture out of this discussion or not yet?
I think who's going to build the... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I think I heard a lot of consensus that we should try out a flat. Yeah, the use case that we have right now is met by a flat tree of this output information, and yeah, if we get that RC, we can start writing some stories to try it out.
That would be something like write user stories to try out a flat tree.
I think there's a little bit of a question about prioritization. So I know this is like a big feature that Paul, you need soon on the for what you're working on with kind of developer workflows. And so there's maybe a question of some contribution, or kind of having more folks out rather than those who are just on the kind of core team of maintainers in the project kind of help build this forward also.
Yeah, that is true. I can't speak to resources, obviously, but yeah, there was some discussion about that early on. That is definitely the case. And also, we should probably include someone from the CLI in this too, because the way I envisaged we would consume this is via via the CLI effectively. So the CLI would be the clients to this thing. Like it has a wait flag today, which only works in a very small set of use cases. So I would hope that the rules that we were talking about earlier, the kind of tree navigation that we were talking about earlier, I would hope would end up in the CLI in some shape or form. So we probably need to loop them into. We may need to, they may be able to help out also.
Sounds good. Happy to chat with anybody that's working on that use case you're looking into.
Yeah. I can. Lisa is off this week. My engineering manager for the IDE, she's off this week. But I can let her know about this conversation and the request, and we can go from there, I think.
That's good.
Thank you. Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining, for providing your input, for spending time with us. This is great.
Yeah, no problem. If is there any actions you want me to take on the RFC itself? I know there's some comments on there now, but I can add. Yeah, would you like me to do something with those comments, or should I just leave them open for the time being?
I don't know if it's an action item for you. I would like to, as I said, RFC3 has been hanging out for a long time and relates directly to is the same use case.
Okay.
So I would like to get this RFC finalized. Are there? I was saying I think really the only thing that's hanging out. No, I think there are two issues that I heard that were hanging out. One we discussed to length, which is should it be a tree structure or should it be a flat list? I was convinced I started by advocating for trees, and I was convinced by folks advocating for a flat list. I don't know where Josh stands on that.
Again, no strong opinion either way. It was more just like trying to practically solve problems that I saw early on, which aren't problems anymore. So fine either way.
I would like to see on the RFC before it's ratified the actual user stories or use cases. I just like to capture that a little clearer at the top.
The ones I'm specifically coming with, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. I can definitely have this.
I just want to. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that one thing that I also heard in our conversation that I'm still puzzling is what should be done. Do we invalidate when the workload changes? How do we represent the workload has changed, and that wasn't something that I was considering before, and I think that
if it's not a resource, then we don't have to.
It's kind of like the same changes that might happen behind the scenes in KPAC, right? Like, yes, some parameterization into the service has changed, but that doesn't mean that, artifact A is not, or like a particular commit is, didn't pass from Flux into KPAC. I think the harder thing is what happens when the supply chain changes. Do we keep like references to the jobs that no longer exist? Like, do we try to preserve some of it? Do we blow it all away? That I'm less certain about, but maybe that's kind of part of that question, right? What if, what happens when something changes that could invalidate the tree? I'm not sure if I meant to exclude that.
Yeah, I guess really it's a question of like what happens on update. On delete, when a workload is deleted or a template is deleted or the supply chain, or I think that things should be deleted. But when they're updated, if the user, for example, updated their workload so that it suddenly pointed to a new repo, do we just trust the user to understand?
Yes.
There's still a supply chain that's still stamping out your old repo, and until those changes propagate through, that'll continue to be the case. If so, then I'm fine with just saying.
I think the benefit we have is the artifacts are immutable. And so like if you change your branch, right, to a different branch of, it would be a different source of commits, but the commits flowing through the pipeline right now would still be valid commits that came from a Git repo that are traceable. It doesn't really invalidate the context of the graph. So I guess we're okay.
Yeah, and as to the supply chain, I feel like the only thing that would nuke the status is if the supply chain that was selected was different. I'm concerned about multiple selected supply chains. We haven't talked about that. But if you select for a different supply chain, then the old one is not going to be updated anymore. Maybe we have a per supply chain status tree. But if you change the current one in any way, shape, or form, it doesn't change what was, it only changes what becomes. So quite often you can make changes to a supply chain that leaves several objects in play, right? So I don't think we need to worry too much about that until we hit edge cases on that. I'm just much more concerned about the selecting for multiple supply chains. That would be, and I think we can solve that just by enumerating them.
Yeah, I think it could be eventually it could be a list in the status of the trees for
Yes.
keyed against the supply chain.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I just wanted to back on the topic of whether we do the tree or the flat, status. I think I'm a big fan of the flat status, but one thing I said earlier was about cube control describe, like being able to visualize there. You can't yet, there's an open issue about it. You can't yet customize cube control describe for CRD. So don't like, you shouldn't take that as an argument for.
I'm not as surprised as I thought I was, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about something else.
Well, I think ultimately we can always talk about visualization later, but I honestly believe it is hard to track possibly rootless trees in any other way than in a record set. So that's the best way to go.
Totally agree. I just didn't want to make a bad argument for it. I think a lot of projects like Argo have a CLI that lets you visualize it in different ways with custom logic. That's KPack has a CLI, for example, KP that does similar things. So I think that's still a good path forward.
Great. Okay. Thank you for all this discussion. It's really important. Well, we ran out of time. So I don't know if these 2 minutes, if Rush, there is something your open mic items that you consider urgent and bring it up here.
5 seconds just so I can
Renaming
see them.
delivery or client fake. Mine is not urgent, so I will skip it.
Right. Yeah, I think like very quickly, I would very much like to talk about the top item as quickly as we can to find out if there's a way that we can act on it, which is 2 items needed a rename in this finalize issue that so this is one issue I just like us to look at, which is the one that Stephen has posted about receiving a deployment instead of receiving the source. I'd just like to get ratification on that so that we could implement rather than change, because we haven't written the code yet, or we've only written a tiny amount of it. So it'd be easier to change today than later. So it doesn't have to be solved in here, but I just would like us to decide whether we're going to do it or not.
Just like to respond to your comment, and I got to drop off in a minute, so I'll be very quick. To respond to your comment in that issue about the kind of motivation for moving the deployment to the beginning of that resource, I think it makes it more explicit. So like at the end of that chain of deployments, you provide the deployment as a source value to something else explicitly. Like you see, I'm taking from deployment and putting into source. This makes the cast into a deployment equally explicit and follow the same pattern. You're taking a source and putting it into a deployment, which I again, it's very like,
I like it.
Yeah.
I really like it. My concern was simply that you don't often take a deployment. You don't often take a type into a named type template. You don't often take a source into a source. You don't often take a config into a config. You usually omit them, right? Just typically.
Well, isn't a tecton pipeline, like if you're running unit tests in that example, isn't that a source that takes a source?
Yes, no, I was saying typically, not all the time.
Typically.
Yes, yeah, and that was all. And I don't think it's a big issue. I just wanted to raise it for thought. It's up to everyone whether they want to ratify it. The other one was also, you mentioned in here, a custom deployment validation template. So it's a heck of a mouthful, but I kind of
Yeah.
like a deployment validation over the what do we call it? A delivery template?
Delivery template. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the other issue. I was wondering if we could list. Are we all okay with switching to this? Does anyone have any big objections to switching to those two names?
We go to that, but I have to drop off. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
I like the new changes too, so I'm in favor.
We can always change them again in the future. It's just that these seem like they've been discussed and thought about. So I figure we pick them up today and we hate them later because everything else was arbitrary as well.
Just in terms of a little bit of UX for people writing them, rather than cluster deployment template, we could do a cluster deploy template, and rather than deployment validation, we could do deploy check.
Validation seems like a better word for me. And the deploy versus deployment, I always thought it was going to be deploy, but it got changed to deployment at some point. I'm not sure. I think we need to raise that and find out why that changed, because it was deploy originally in the original RFC.
I agree with you that validation tracks closer to my understanding. I'm talking straight, just like
Typing.
which is easier to talk about with your colleagues. Like,
All right. Well, we
the
might just
deploy
defer
check
on,
is failing.
we might defer on making a choice about this and have another discussion before we just try to race into something. Do we have a designer assigned to this work?
I think the changes in general though with the source, I don't think anyone's debating that, right? Having the deployment as the input.
Yep. It's a source or it's a issue already, so we just need to prioritize it so that it's caught immediately. But yeah, the other one we can discuss and maybe get some design or UX input. Sorry for taking us over time, David.
Anything else? Good. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Yes.